Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the voltage regulation performance of the Asrock Z370 Extreme 4. Let's just put it, the short version is, it's really bad, and I'm really not sure why it's so bad, but I got the board off of eBay, so it is secondhand, so there is a chance that it might have been like, living in an oven for the last 2 years, because it is a Z370 board, so those have been released for roughly 2 years, so yeah, there's a chance it's been running in an oven for a very long time, and that's maybe why it's producing such awful performance, or it was always awful, and, even if I tested a new one, it would have just been an absolute disaster. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to blame with with the Extreme 4 on the terrible performance, because from a physical like looking at the board, there doesn't really seem to be anything wrong with it on a sort of physical level, but yeah, the numbers speak for themselves. The board is so bad that whereas all of the other relatively, well, this isn't really a high-end board, this is sub $200, that's like $160. Okay, this is a wait, no, that's like a $250 board. That's, yeah, so that's a modified version of a $250 board, but that's like a $200 board. That is a $300 board. That is a $500 board. So, like testing on like good motherboards, I was doing all of my testing at 5.1 gigahertz because, well, it was running. Everything was passing at 5.1 gigahertz, and I was like, cool, we'll just do all the testing at 5.1 gigahertz. The target voltage was 1.3 volts, so that means the load voltage was 1.3 volts in software, using the DieSense. Now, admittedly, some of these boards don't have DieSense, and for those boards, I just went by whatever average voltage the oscilloscope was reading. That was close enough to the average voltage of other motherboards where I did have DieSense. So, 1.36 to 1.37 volts was kind of the acceptable range. There are some exceptions to that, like this board right here, where it's 1.3 to 1.35. But anyway, yeah, like I'm not sure how that works, but hey, I'm not gonna argue with the measurements, right? Because if I did, well, yeah, I'd potentially be botching the numbers. So anyway, this does have DieSense, so not that that was particularly helpful. The issue is that the board's voltage regulation is so incredibly bad that, yes, I lost 200 megahertz running the Extreme 4. Now, admittedly, that's at the level 1 LLC, but that's not a zero droop LLC, as the set voltage was 1.35 volts, the actual load voltage was 1.3, and the average, according to the oscilloscope, was around 1.37. So the oscilloscope numbers line up, with the load voltage here. But funnily enough, yeah, like even Prime 95 16 KFFT size, it was not doing that test. Like, it wasn't doing it at 5.1 gigahertz. It did it at 5 gigahertz, but the 128K test was failing because that is by far the lowest minimum out of any motherboard I tested. Well, the thing is, I'm scrolling up, but all of the motherboards listed further up the list are actually just better at that test. So, it's just like the closest you could get with is a Z390 Pro from Gigabyte, but that board still managed to pass at 5 gigahertz for all of its testing. And admittedly, maybe, at level 2 LLC, where the board wasn't so god awful in terms of voltage regulation, or level 3, it might have been able to run 5.1 gigahertz at that point, but that would have also screwed up the peak-to-peak values relative to the other measurements, which is why I just kept it at 4.9 everywhere, because the thing is, if you increase the CPU frequency, the peak-to-peak values actually increase with it. Not a huge amount, but it is noticeable, where it's like going between certain test results, I'd forget that I'm still at like 4.9 or I'm still at 5.1 gigahertz, and I'd go like, oh, there's a performance improvement, and then I'm like, wait a minute, the frequency is lower. Then I'd raise the frequency and the performance would be back to where it was supposed to be, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm an idiot. Anyway, so the thing is like, yeah, once if the board needs 4.9 gigahertz to pass this test, it needs I'm going to run it at 4.9 on every test, just so that the peak-to-peak values stay sort of comparable to the board itself, right? Because if I was changing the frequency up and down, then it would just be screwing up the measurements. But it also does mean that this board is actually doing less work than all of the other motherboards in this testing, and it's still performing worse. Also, it's worth noting that this motherboard's voltage regulation is so out of whack that I actually was I'm actually disappointed with my measurement methodology, because this value, the minimum voltage, is a average of 2,000 samples. Yeah, that doesn't work that great when this motherboard is periodically dropping into like the 1.22 volt range in 16K FFT size. And that doesn't reflect on the minimums, because it would happen, out of the 2,000 samples, it would maybe happen on 10, 50, okay, a low number of results would actually go that low. But there was pretty regular just voltage dips that were in like massive for no apparent reason, and that's why it wasn't passing 5 gigahertz. Because if we just went by this minimum value, like, you'd be like, well, that's why it wasn't passing 5.1 gigahertz, because 1.3 is actually not that bad. This average value, not that bad, but the board was actually just, there was massive voltage dips in between those 1.3 volt average, in that 1.3 volt average, where it's just like, well, that is why it's not doing 5.1. So yeah, basically it's like, I should, like, with this board, in order for you to see just how bad it is, I would have had to use like absolute minimum results, instead of the average minimum, because on other boards I didn't really run into that issue. Well, so there's a couple boards that do some similar things, but not anywhere as, like, it's nowhere near as bad as this one in terms of the absolute, like, extreme minimums. So yeah, and unfortunately I can't set up my oscilloscope to track both the number of samples, which is like a really stupid restriction if you think about it. Like, it won't tell me how many samples I have if I have it set to monitor the absolute minimum value, which is just like, well, that's dumb, isn't it? So, yeah. Kind of limit, again, just, test equipment limitations. Other annoying limitations are like, I don't have 3 decimal places. Like, I really wish I had 3 decimal places. Yeah, don't have those. Anyway, the good news is, in the 128K test, the fact that, like, this isn't accurate doesn't matter, because this is. And this is really low. Like, legitimately, the voltage did not go significantly below that average minimum right there. And yeah, this explains exactly why the board doesn't do 5.1 gigahertz. It's 356 millivolts peak to peak, so basically it's got more overshoot than, I do believe, yes, everything else in this chart. It's got more overshoot than it, and it also has more undershoot, and just, it's terrible. Like, honestly, it's absolutely bloody god awful. 1.18 volt minimums. You're losing, like, what is it? Like, compared to some of the other boards here, you're losing like 80 to, like, well, the thing is you shouldn't really be running that. But let's say, let's say you were running a, like 50 millivolt droop LLC. So that'd be comparable to like that'd be like minus 75% on the dark. And yes, the dark is almost like, it's more than twice the price of the Extreme 4. But, thing is just like, for people who think that your motherboard choice doesn't make a difference, that's 90 millivolts, right? This is the difference between runs 5.1 gigahertz, doesn't run for 5.1 gigahertz, right? Like, that right there is where that difference comes from. Or, let's go with the less ridiculous board. Well, we have the Z390 Pro, but this one doesn't run 5.1 gigahertz either. This one has to run 5, but, that right there, that's your, well, actually, that's Ultra Extreme LLC. Extreme LLC is more comparable, and again, I think on Extreme LLC, the Z390 Pro would have probably done fine at 5.1 gigahertz, because looking at some of the other motherboards, it looks like the requirement to pass 5.1 gigahertz is 1.22 minimums on average, because that's what the Master was doing, and it was still finishing at 5.1 gigahertz. And then the Z390i Gaming Edge was doing 1.24, to finish. But also, that's like Ultra Extreme LLC. That's no V-droop. Whereas level 1 on the Extreme 4, that's not no V-droop. That's 50 millivolts a droop. It's just bloody awful. So, yeah. And then when you look at the 192K test, everything still sucks. And the idle performance is actually okay. It's not the worst, but it's also not particularly great. And also it's completely irrelevant, because, sitting idle on your desktop is not really like that. That's not a stability hazard. That's a stability hazard. That's a stability hazard. This isn't. So, Anyway, and then at level 2 LLC, you know, we pick up 20 millivolts of minimum. So now it might do 5 gigahertz instead of just 4.9. And at level 3 LLC, it was doing 1.23. So at level 3 LLC, it might have actually run 5.1 gigahertz, judging by, you know, the results from other motherboards. Also, it is worth noting that at 5.1, it would probably actually drive the minimum voltage down a little bit, but it would probably pass because there is there is the master passing at 1.22 minimums. So the Extreme 4, at least the one I tested, is just atrocious. Like, it is god awful at voltage regulation. And yeah. And it, like, the nearest comparable board to it is obviously the Z390 Pro from Gigabyte. Which is why I actually ended up testing the board, because I realized after I finished, like, I didn't have these results until I tested this, and I was like, wait a minute, we can't compare this to all of the other motherboards I've tested so far, because they're just so much freaking better, even though this one's, like, similar price point. Like, that's the crazy thing, is, like, that's a little ITX board, and it's not that much more like, you know, it's around $150, $160, and that one's doing a hell of a lot better than the Extreme 4 is. So yeah, I think like at this point, I kind of wish it was I wasn't testing a second, like, no, not kind of. I really wish I wasn't testing a second hand board and instead had like a Z390 Extreme 4, so that I could compare against a motherboard where it's like, I know for a fact, like, this is how it comes from the factory instead of like, this is whatever turned up from eBay, right? Like, there is some concerns with that. So still, the Z390 Pro, you know, is roughly like the most comparable motherboard I have, because it's, in terms of price point, like, that's a sub $200, or more like the VRM on that is a sub $200 VRM, because you can get it on the same VRM on the Z390 Elite. Yeah, that board's doing a lot better, and that actually goes all the way to a flat LLC. Yeah. Also, it's worth noting I did test offset on the Z390 Pro, and it does the same thing as the Z390 Aorus Master, where it's just like, well, optimal LLC on the Pro is really like maybe even medium. You'd want to run medium, because the minimums otherwise, like, yeah, this board's voltage regulation, it's not the best, right? So for a 1.45 volt set voltage, 1.27 minimum, that is, I do believe, yeah, that's like 40 millivolts lower than... yeah, well, okay, those are the Gene and the Dark. It's actually kind of comparable to the Master. Like, it really makes me wonder, is just like, does Gigabyte literally have a design guideline that it's like, hey, if we hit this level of performance, it's good enough, and we're not going to go any further? Because, like, their boards are kind of on top of each other, right? Where it's like 1.27 at 1.45, 1.28, 1.455. Anyway, if we keep growing up, we've got the Master. The Gaming Edge for a 1.45 volt set voltage does 1.29, so that's a 20 millivolt advantage. And then we have the Asrock Phantom Gaming ITX, which for a set voltage of 1.47 has a 40 millivolt advantage, but for a 1.42 volts, it still has a 20. It's still a 20 millivolt advantage. Actually, for 1.47 volts, it's a 1.3. It's a 30 millivolt advantage, because that's 1.28 down there. So yeah, basically this is the second worst board I've tested, but it's still significantly better than the Asrock Extreme 4. And yeah, now, like, the thing is just like, if we look at the board, right, because that's always the thing, is just like, the reason why I'm so interested in this testing is to see, like, what designs work, what designs don't work. And so the Extreme 4 is a 5-phase VRM, so this right here is our V-core. And that's just 5 phases. I know it looks a hell of a lot like 10, but if you look at the back of the board, these chips right here are single output drivers, so they can only, well, and these drivers are basically hooked up to both of the dual NFETs in parallel, so the phases switch, well, you don't really have phases. Like, the funny thing is, the actual power plane, so the switch node for each inductor, so that's the connection between the not a power stage, the dual NFET and the inductor. The power plane for that connection is actually, like, it looks like this. So you could actually, like, desolder this inductor, and the current going through this dual NFET right here would just squeeze alongside the current from that one through there. Or you could, you know, remove this MOSFET, and it would go like that. So yeah, that's great, Asrock. But anyway, so this is very much like this is a total 5-phase. Which is technically like, here's the thing, there's other 5-phase boards that are doing great, right? Just look at the Maximus 11 Gene. That thing's absolutely killing it with its 5-phase. And it's also worth noting that the Z390 Aorus Pro, I didn't know this when I was first covering the board, but that thing actually runs its doublers in synchronous mode, which is like, I still need to figure out like why are, like, I'm gonna add like, well, I'm already asking Gigabyte about like, wait, why are you using doublers if you're not actually going to use their doubling functionality at all, right? Like, they still get some current balancing out of them, but it's just like, so the Z390 Aorus Pro is technically a 6-phase. The Master has doubling. That one actually doubles. I need to check some of the other motherboards using intersil doublers because yeah, it really makes me wonder, like, is nobody, does everybody not, like, does nobody use the actual doubling functionality on those? Because there's a chance that's actually the case. But anyway, so this is a 5-phase, so, you know, and hey, the Phantom Gaming ITX is also a 5-phase, right? And that blows this one away. So the phase count really not a massive concern here in terms of the voltage regulation. Like, there are some advantages that you could get with a higher phase count, but you can still make, you know, a perfectly good VRM with a low phase count or even a high phase count. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter that much. The capacitor configuration for bulk, we're looking at all of these for vCore. So these are like for your iGPU. These are for VCCIO and VCCSA. We've got a rather interesting mix of capacitors. So for comparison, like Gigabyte and well, actually all of the Z3 others, like all of the Z390 motherboards, they just use 560 microfarads for their largest capacitors. This uses 820s. So that's an 820, 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 and that's an 820. So we've got 6 820 microfarad capacitors. So the total capacitance on this is quite high. And then we've also got these two 16-volt capacitors, which are 100 microfarads each as well. So there's a lot of capacitance in this VRM. But the funny, for comparison, like all of the Gigabyte boards just use just use the same, like 560 microfarad capacitors over and over and over again. And the idea behind using sort of different capacitance sizes in your capacitors is that you can get different ESRs and different ESLs in the different capacitance values. The thing is, these are also rated for 16 volts. So if anything, I think that these probably have worse ESR, not better ESR, than if you were just using like a 2.5 volt capacitor, which is what these are. These are 2.5 volts. They are all rated for 12,000 hours, so they should be really high endurance. So I'm like, you know, the theory I had where it's like, well, maybe it's a used board. It's, you know, it could be 2 years old. It could have spent 2 years in an oven. That would have been a very hot oven because these are rated for 12,000 hours at 105 degrees. So in order to get these capacitors to like significantly degrade, you'd probably have to run the board at like 130 VRM temperature for a very long time. And that just seems kind of unlikely. But I don't know. Maybe this was somebody's like, you know, like closet video rendering workstation, right? So yeah, I'm really not sure why like the VRM is doing so badly, because the capacitors, like, they're really high endurance. They shouldn't really be degrading. And then inside the socket, we just have a bunch of 0603s. Like, honestly, the socket capacitor configuration looks better than what you'd get on an MSI Z390 iGaming Edge AC. So I guess that gives MSI credit for, you know, managing to cut down on the total number of capacitors and still retaining great performance. But yeah, so, you know, like, the thing is, on the front of the socket, I'm not sure, right? So all of these 06, they're not all vCore. Some of them are going to be iGPU. Some of them are going to be like VCCSA, VCCIO, VDDR. There's probably 1 or 2 for VDDR there. But on the back of the board, I know for a fact that it's typically the 4 middle rows. So that's these 4. that are your actual vCore. And this looks fine. Like, this looks very similar to what you'd see on a lot of the Z390 boards from Gigabyte. It looks better than what you'd see on, like, an MSI Z390 board. You know, if we look at the capacitor configuration, I don't really see anything particularly wrong. We can see plenty of power plane stitching as well, right, for all of the outputs of the various inductors. There's plenty of stitching around the legs of the actual capacitors as well. Asrock seems to have done a better job of the power plane stitching around the capacitors than, say, Gigabyte. Now you might be thinking, is this right down here a power plane? Nope, that's just ground, but that's fine. They have 4 layers, so, you know, there's plenty of layers to use for power delivery that we basically just can't see. And or at least I think this is a 4-layer board because it could be a 6, but I'd really like it. A board this cheap is unlikely to be a 6-layer. So normally motherboards in the sub $200 range, except like X570 is the exception because a lot of board vendors like to use a 6-layer design because the PCIe trace layout, the PCIe routing is a pain, but for PCIe 4.0 support. But on Z370, where it's just PCIe 3.0, there's really not many reasons to go for a 6-layer board under $200. So yeah, this is just a 4-layer, and well, probably just a 4-layer. I'm just not 100% certain on that. But still, the Z390 Pro from Gigabyte, that's also a 4-layer, and that one's performing just fine. And on paper, like the capacitor configuration on that one looks not that great. So yeah, I'm really not sure why a VRM that looks like this is producing results that look like this. So yeah. Like, honestly, when I first when I first got my hands on the board, I was honestly kind of worried that I'd be testing another motherboard where it's just like it's not any different from any other like any of the other LGA 1151 boards I tested. But no, this one's significantly worse, but it also makes me question, like, is it degraded? Like, is there something wrong with the board? Because like these are ridiculously bad numbers. So yeah, now funnily enough, I do actually have some more experiments planned for this board because this board is so bad, I don't really feel bad about like destroying it further. So what was suggested to me by someone was that instead of trying to, so with a lot of the other motherboards, right, I've been trying to improve the the voltage regulation performance with extra capacitors. In the case of the gene different inductors, right, then this one has just extra capacitors. So instead of doing that and trying to actually improve on a already very good motherboard design, yeah, instead of doing that, I'm going to try and see how many capacitors can we remove before this becomes really, really bad. I mean, it's already terrible, but it could be worse. So that's kind of the thing I'm wondering about. And I won't be removing any multi-layer ceramics. I'll just be killing off the polymers, because the thing is, the multi-layer ceramics, as long as you don't actually like overheat them, they're going to last forever, essentially. Like, they don't really degrade. Yeah, like they don't degrade. They can be thermally overstressed. So if you like heat them up too much, then they can crack and break and that kind of thing. They can come defect, like if you like, they're weak to physical stress, but they are not weak to like if you run them at rated temperature, they will last forever. So yeah, but if you like hit them with a hammer or something, that'll break them because they're ceramic. So they're susceptible to like thermal shock. They're susceptible to physical like impacts, that kind of damage. They're not really like, if you don't overload them in terms of voltage or well, the thing is, if you pull too much ripple current, if you put too much ripple current through them, they'll overheat, and that's what's going to kill them. So yeah, like these last forever. You're probably never going to see a motherboard where these actually degraded. These, on the other hand, except if they were like incorrectly reflowed or something, then yeah, that could harm those. But these do degrade. Just over time, these get steadily worse. So, it's just like, it would be kind of a cool test. How many capacitors can go missing before you really have a problem? And then once I'm done with pulling all of the capacitors, I'm thinking, well, I'll replace the capacitors the board came with new capacitors from like my own, collection that I use for modding, and we'll see if I can't get it to perform better again, right? Like I'll bring it back up to, well, hopefully bring it back up to acceptable performance levels. So that's what I have in store for the motherboard in the future. But yeah, as it is, just, however the condition it came in from eBay, it's bad. It's really bad. Like, yeah, like I was really surprised that it did so badly. And it does make me wonder, like, I wish I had a new board, because since it's used, it's like these might not be representative of the motherboard you'd actually go out to buy. But if they are, then that's just like, I wouldn't buy this board. Like, there is just no way you would get me to buy this board. And if it's not but yeah, that's kind of the issue. So I'm really, like, now I'm annoyed that it's not a new board. Because I wasn't expecting it to do this badly, because it's like, this can't actually, like, they can't possibly be shipping this, right? Like, come on. Like, when MSI's dinky little ITX board is, like, it's not even slightly beating it, it's blowing it away, right? Like, 1.33 volts set voltage on the MSI gives you a minimum of 1.24, and this stupid thing is doing 1.18? That's a 60 millivolt advantage in favor of the MSI, right? And it's like, this is already not, like, a stellar performer in my test setup, like, out of the boards I tested, and it's just like, yeah, that is blowing the Asrock away. And the Z390 Pro, well, the thing is, like, that's not a comparable result with 1.31 there, but 1.35, you know, again, like, that's a 50 millivolts advantage, where it's just like, yeah, this is bad. This is really freaking bad. And then, of course, you have the piles and piles of overshoot. So when I actually do the test with removing the various capacitors, I'll be doing that at very low voltages, like 1.2 volts set voltage, or maybe 1.15, just so that I don't expose my CPU to needlessly high core voltages. And I'll probably, well, like, if at idle the voltage regulation already looks like a complete disaster, then I'll just not run any actual workloads, because I don't really want to find, like, I am not interested in finding out how much overshoot you need to kill a CPU. Okay, like, well, I am interested in finding that out. I'm not interested in finding that out with an 8700K. Okay, like, 8700Ks cost way too much to use for that kind of to sacrifice in such a stupid in such a stupid way. So yeah, but the Extreme 4, extremely bad. And that is really, like, that's a surprise to me, because this really, like, on paper, this looks fine. So it's just like, yeah, what happened? Because that's an ISL 69138. That's like a high-end intercell voltage controller. That's actually the same controller you see on the Z390 Dark. That's the same controller you see on the Phantom Gaming ITX, the same controller you see on the Z390 Aorus Pro. And those boards, okay, the Pro's not doing that great, but the Dark and the Phantom Gaming ITX, those are killing it in terms of voltage regulation. And yeah, same controller. And then the only difference here is, like, this is on dual NFETs instead of power stages, and this is also on discrete drivers instead of, well, you have to have discrete drivers when you have dual NFETs. So yeah, interesting results. Unfortunately, they raise more, like, again, as with a lot of my other Probinator testing, the results, in my opinion, raise more questions than they answer, and I'm really not pleased with that. So yeah, hopefully you found this somewhat interesting, in terms of just, like, yeah, like, this is how bad it can be, I guess. But now I'm really wondering, like, hey, what if I tested one of those low-end Z390 Asus boards with, like, a 4-phase VRM using, like, it's not even using dual NFETs, it's like using freaking 4C06Bs, 4C06Bs and 4C10B MOSFETs, where it's just like, well, this is a dual NFET, and a relatively good dual NFET. Like, I have the version of the board with the FDPC 5030 SGs from Fairchild, but, like, the 4C10N is slow, and the 4C06 is high RDS on. So yeah, like, what about those really, really bad? Like, what about the really? Actually, no, Asus has Syrah, but those were also not that great MOSFETs. They're, like, on par. So yeah, it's like testing this board makes me wonder about some of the other, like the low-end Z390 boards, but at the same time, like, if I'm gonna, like, at this point, it's like, I don't want to buy another board secondhand, because it's just like, if it spits out numbers like this, it's going to be inconclusive again. At least to me, it's going to be inconclusive. So instead, I'd like to buy a fresh board. But Z390, even the low-end Z390 boards that are complete and that are very probably complete and utter garbage, yeah, they cost, like, 150 quid. So I am not very excited for that. Yeah, these results right here show me that, hey, this testing is actually worth doing, because we finally, like, there's finally a board that isn't in the same, roughly the same performance ballpark as everything else I tested. Because the differences between a lot of these boards are kind of minimal, right? Like, there's not that much difference between a lot of these. Well, except, like, the Dark. The Dark's just kind of killing everything, along with the... Yeah, yeah, the Gene as well. All right. Well, the thing is, this board doesn't have a low, like a high enough. Well, there needs to be a level 2.5. That's what that needs. Anyway, yeah. Also, it actually, like, I am thinking of buying an intercell voltage controller programmer at this point. So I could actually reprogram the LLC on this to get that level 2.5. So that'll be interesting. And then I can also mess around with like reprogramming actually like all of the intercell boards. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. You can find a link to that down in the description. That's how I paid for the Extreme 4. And then I also have a Teespring if you don't like Patreon, where you can get like shirts, stickers, posters, various AHOC merch. That also helps with paying for things like, terrible motherboards in order to test how bad can it be. Very bad, evidently. So, yeah, if you'd like to check those out, those do help immensely with running the channel because, at this point, I think, honestly, like, with some board vendors, I'm pretty sure if I told them, yeah, I'm going to take an oscilloscope to the VRM of your motherboard, it's going to be like, for me, it's like, okay, well, it's not like, it depends on the vendor, but like I already can't get Asrock boards, so it's just like I have to buy my Asrock boards and I have to buy Asus boards. Asus doesn't want to send me an Apex, and it's just like, I just want to see if you have a board that beats the Gene. Come on. Like, it can't be worse than the Gene, and the Gene is already killing it on these charts as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that's why I'd love to test the Apex. Is just like, hey, is that even better? But no, they don't want to send one. And, well, Asrock at this point is just like, yeah, they're definitely not going to send one. So, anyway, I need that Patreon money and the Teespring money to buy boards, because otherwise they're not getting tested. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.